Hello, everyone. Welcome to this presentation on conflict and governance, where I will be talking about the link between groundwater, conflicts, and socio-ecological resilience of the borderlands of the Horn of Africa. My name is Edinah Samuel, and together with my colleague Nancy Balfour, we will be presenting this piece of research that we conducted with a team of researchers from the Rift Valley Institute and Center for Humanitarian Change. The way this presentation is going to be structured, I will present the objectives and the methodology of the research, but also talk a little bit about what do we mean when we talk about conflict and fragility in the borderlands of the Horn of Africa and also in relation to groundwater. I will then present the results or the findings of the work, and then my colleague Nancy Balfour will come in to provide a broader reflections of the findings and also the conclusions. On to the objectives. We were interested in really looking at issues around or the dynamics around water, fragility, and social exclusion that should inform the development or the rehabilitation of rural water supplies. And our second objective was focused on understanding and providing recommendations around the stakeholders that are involved in the development of rural groundwater supply systems. Through this, we adopted a mixed method approach, and this was mainly qualitative. And the process started with an intensive literature review, followed by preliminary consultations and conversations with government and donor-based institutions in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And these were our countries of focus. We then went ahead to have conversations with a number of experts that have worked in this region, but are also knowledgeable about the subject. Essentially, this gave us a very high-level perspective and understanding of these dynamics, but we were so much interested in understanding what the local dynamics look like and also getting perspectives of the various stakeholders that are working at the local level. And this includes the community members themselves. So through this, we adopted a deep dive case study analysis. And essentially, for those who know the Horn of Africa, this is a region that is quite vast, but it also presents its own set of, complexities that are very distinct from each other. So essentially going, with these different case studies was an opportunity for us to compare and generate a mixture of context-specific insights, as well as have these cross-cutting lessons across the various areas or regions that we selected. So using a set of indicators, we selected Kalobeye refugee site in Turkana County, and this is an area that gave us an understanding around the dynamics between the refugees and the host communities, but also the cross-border conflicts with the pastoralist communities. In Somalia, Matabani district in Hirshabelle state was selected to provide an understanding around the distinct complexities that exist between the different communities or ethnic groups. And finally, our final case study in Ethiopia was in Dilo, Kebele, in Borena zone. And this is a region that has exhibited some good progress and some sort of, successes with regard to informal or customary institutions with the way they manage the water, the groundwater resources, management and sharing of water resources, but also addressing conflict. So I'll set this in a little bit to talk about what do we mean when we talk about fragility and conflict, and what did we see how fragility and conflict exhibits itself in these regions or in these areas. Essentially, when we talk about fragility, we see fragility manifesting itself in various forms, but it also encompasses a number of interconnected factors, including issues around political instability, weak governance structures, social tensions, economic vulnerabilities, and environmental degradation. Secondly, when we talk about conflict, quite often, the common narrative that comes up is, when we see things getting drier or when things tend to get drier, then we see a situation where conflicts tend to increase. But interestingly, this is not quite often the case. There are a number of factors associated with water-related conflicts, and it really explains why we need to talk about these factors and the need to have an understanding of the complexities that are contributing to the failure of water-related projects. So one is conflict is very historical. History matters in this region in the sense that the cross-border and intercommunal conflicts are associated with pastoral identities, but they're also passed on through generations from one generation to another. In terms of the factors that contribute or exacerbate conflicts, there are so many other factors, and this includes population increase, there's climate change, there's also the aspect of political elite capture, and the growing pressure on resources. Another aspect that was really interesting and that came out from this piece of work is quite often externally aid actors that are, implement water-related interventions in these areas, they fail to recognize that these conflict dimensions are very complex and often hidden. We also see lack of synergy between the formal and informal institutions, approaches to conflict resolution, and this breeds confusion, but also creates a fertile ground for growing conflict. And quite often the cyclical nature of, these factors that we see, they tend to undermine development and peace building efforts. So I will now go into presenting a little bit further about the results the findings from the work. One is on, as I talked about water and conflict. Quite often water is a driver of conflict, but it's not the primary source. But it can also be used as a platform for peace building. And quite often it's really the international or the external aid interventions. They fail to recognize these, these issues that these local communities are facing, and which is one of the contributions why we see the failure of most of the groundwater interventions that are being implemented in these areas. Secondly, it's on issues around groundwater and governance, and we see, the presence of customary practices that are quite dictating on, how water resources are being shared and cooperation among the various communities or ethnic groups. But most of the formal systems tend to undermine the customary practices. But we also see some customary institutions that have retained some supremacy and legitimacy and have demonstrated the significant capacity to reduce conflicts. And the last one is, climate resiliency outcomes, where groundwater development interventions are quite often thought of reducing climate resilience, but it's often the interventions around groundwater development do not produce the resiliency outcomes that we see. Instead, resiliency is easily undermined by ill-informed drought response strategies, but also the pathways are very complex and they depend on many factors. And this includes issues around social capacity. And we see that there are some preconditions that are really required to see a genuine resiliency building in these fragile areas. I now hand over to my colleague, Nancy Balfour. Thank you.
I'd like to talk about the recommendations of the study. How do we get better outcomes for the populations at risk in drought-prone and conflict areas? So my first recommendation is to suggest that we don't rush in with emergency water supply projects in these drought emergencies. We need to stop and think. We need to stop and think, consider what the conflict dynamics are in these contexts, who owns the resources, who's using the resources, how are they being used, and consider this in our project design. If we rush in with the assumption that water is needed now and everywhere, we risk creating a situation that's actually worse in the long term. This includes considering the dynamics and conflicts between tensions between IDPs and refugees. It includes understanding how the groundwater is used by which groups and when. Secondly, the recommendation from the study is that we work and strengthen customary institutions. That all too often when we're putting in place an emergency water supply, we think that our sustainability for that is to put in place a new committee without considering what was already in place. The recommendations that emerge from this study are that those governance systems for these groundwater supplies in fragile areas need to be hybrid. They need to include the customary institutions that have been the guardians of water resources in those communities for many years. The third recommendation is around the level of consultation that we have. The study showed that the users of groundwater supplies are often a much wider group than we imagine. It's not just the immediate community and the immediate surrounding area. There's migrant groups of pastoralists. There's commercial interests using the boreholes for private water trucking or commercial water trucking. There's both domestic and livestock use. There may also be agricultural use. So there are a lot of users. We need to consult widely, and we need to see how the interests of these users are included in what we design, but also included in the management and governance going forward. To create resilience outcomes, we need to explore why the previous water supplies have failed. We need to learn from those failures, and we need to make sure that we don't repeat those failures. So we need to consider the way that the water supply is used and the potential for it to be sustained in the future and to provide reliable water. So it's not just the sustainability of the infrastructure, it's also the sustainability of the systems that govern it and the systems that govern water and natural resource use more broadly. If we consider that and we build resilience in a broader sense, then we're more likely to have success going forward. Thank you very much. So those are our main recommendations, and that's the end of our presentation for today. I'd like to open the floor for any questions. We'd really like to hear from those online attending this session on your experience of groundwater in these fragile areas in the Horn of Africa and other similar contexts around the world. Any questions?